thought it would be a really good idea to run a webinar that basically tells you from our point of view what we think can be done, what's achievable in this, and give you a little bit more information from Matt's research. So if you have any questions, please let us know. Put them in the question box, we'll answer at the end, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thanks, Em. So yeah, as Emily said, what we're going to give today is really our overview of what we have learned over the last few months, as it's been talking to customers, talking to facilities managers. There is a wealth of information, some good, some bad out there on all of this. And what I've tried to do is break the presentation down into just a few key areas that I see are really affecting us today. What I will say up front is, much like the BBC, whenever I talk about something specific, so a specific product, there are obviously other solutions available. I'm going to touch on a few things from a couple of different manufacturers here. That's not a via recommending one thing over another. It's just an example of what's being done today and what's available. So bear that in mind, especially if you see something from one of your competitors. So I wanted to touch on this kind of overused phrase about the new normal, and just to think about some of the wider trends we're seeing when it comes to the challenge of how buildings are going to reoccupy. What does that look like? I've limited this to in-building concerns because there are obviously other things like access to public transport and so on. But obviously, one of the biggest impacts is going to be the social distancing. So is it 1 meter plus? Is it 1 meter plus other things? Is it 2 meters? Everybody's making different decisions on this. Facilities Management Journal did a webinar a couple of weeks ago where they were talking to facilities managers. A lot of those buildings were erring on the side of 2 meter, because if you read the government guidelines closely, it says 1 meter plus, but ideally 2 meters. And the attitude of a lot of these buildings is, well, we'll go with 2 meters because that's the lower risk. The other things we're seeing talked about are phased returns, partial occupancies of buildings. This has thrown up a lot of kind of, I guess, big debates. Is it going to be the end of the office? Are we all going to work from home? Is this it? The centre of London, are we desolate? I think the answer to that is no. Yes, we've proven remote working, but I think we've also seen the inherent inefficiencies of this. And at the end of the day, we are social animals. The smart working revolution was going to be 20 years ago. Well, it didn't happen. It's taken this to force us to try it. So is it going to be the end of the office? No, it isn't. Is it going to be the end of the high rise? There's been some articles about this. Let's stop building skyscrapers. Again, probably not. What would replace the high rise? We build high rise buildings to a certain extent because we want to, but also because we need to when it comes to density and so on. The other big thing we're seeing is this desire for a contactless environment. This whole situation has thrown up how much today relies on a touch screen. Whether you are paying for car parking or, quite frankly, paying for your groceries at the supermarket, you may now well be presented with a touch screen, which previously I certainly didn't give much thought to who touched it before me, who was going to touch it afterward. And even things like door handles. On the right-hand side there, I've included a picture of one of these slightly odd little tools which are now advertised all over the internet for pushing buttons, pulling handles and so on. So yeah, perhaps we're all going to start carrying those, I don't know. The other interesting thing that's come out in conversations with buildings is that cleaning is going to become a visible function. Previously, you brought the cleaners in after hours. It was something that you had to stay late to see the cleaners. Well, now people want that security. They want that reassurance that somebody is going round cleaning surfaces every hour, whatever it looks like. And that obviously will have an impact on us as cleaning regimes start to basically encompass the lift, and I'll touch on that later. The other interesting trend is this deployment of sensors throughout buildings. So for the last, 2 years, we've heard about, smart buildings, IoT. There's going to be sensors here, there, and everywhere. Well, What's interesting now is we are seeing body temperature sensors going into buildings. We are seeing a boom in people putting in occupancy sensors, or those companies like banks and so on in London who had adopted occupancy sensors for things like working out desk utilization. Well, actually now those same systems are getting used for things like making sure it's every other desk that's being used to maintain social distancing. The facial recognition industry has undergone a slightly weird revolution, as before they were looking for people with masks because we judged people with masks to be suspicious. Now they're looking to make sure we're wearing our mask and are actually issuing an alert if we're not. So we've got all of this going on in the built environment and within the building. And what's interesting is I'm noticing that lifts are increasingly becoming a focus within this debate. So here's a couple of nice panic-stricken headlines from the last few days. The Independent gave us coronavirus. Women infect 71 people after one lift trip. Heck of a big lift, I was thinking. But actually, only one infection can be attributed to the lift. The issue was that of the people who had used the lift, one of them then went to a party. Wasteful, damaging and outmoded was the attack that The Guardian launched on skyscrapers, actually more related to energy efficiency, but dressed up slightly as a skyscrapers as this spread of COVID. My personal favourite is if COVID-19 isn't a problem for elevators, let's bring back the paternoster. Unsurprisingly, if anyone is unfamiliar with the paternoster, please Google it. As somebody who attended Leicester University in the late 90s, I'm very familiar with paternosters. And unsurprisingly, this article said that, yes, whilst it might help, paternosters obviously have all of the known and inherent safety issues. But lifts are becoming part of this debate. So if it's not something your customers are already asking you about, and my understanding, speaking to people in the UK, in the US, across Europe, is this is very high on everybody's radar. What can we do? It's going to become an important part of the customer conversation. So starting to break this down, I think the first thing we're seeing is the impact on site access. So actually getting engineers on site, being able to go on site to do walkthroughs and so on. And literally right from the front door, we're seeing people have problems. The check-in registration process in buildings, we still have a lot of paper sign-in sheets. Well, now do we want everybody touching a paper sign-in sheet? No, we don't. Oh, well, it's all right. We got rid of that. We put in a touch screen. Touch screens. We don't want this. But there is still this need to record site attendance to understand who's on site. And I think many people have experienced this issue where an engineer's been sent to site and after the fact, the building staff question, oh, well, I didn't see your engineer. Are you sure he was here? Are you sure he did work? So again, we're having conversations with people about deployment of engineer on site buttons again, that there is a separate way of recording that that engineer is there, something that we can put behind the motor room door or a way that only engineers can access. All of this is coming back. Interestingly, this part of wanting fewer people on site, and that's related to the idea of partial occupancy, is beginning to include engineering visits. So there's a desire to limit how many people are coming onto site. And what I've seen here is, yes, there's a desire to limit the number of visits, but buildings are open to having longer visits to encompass more work. So if they would normally have an engineer, possibly there multiple times over a month to do different things, well, let's actually now talk about that engineer being on site for longer, maybe a whole day, but they're going to do more work, and that then interrupts the amount of time before they need to come back. Obviously, there are things like regular maintenance, regular inspection that we can't change because those things are inherently tied to a certain schedule. But again, it's a conversation to have with buildings about, okay, you don't want somebody there multiple times, but can we group different jobs together and I'll have someone on site for longer, but that means you only have one, let's say, outside person visiting your site for that amount of time. The other thing this brings up is remote access. Those of you who attended my previous webinar about monitoring and so on know that I certainly feel that this is somewhere where we're a little behind as an industry. But we're seeing a move from the old, I want to see someone on site, I want to see an engineer here doing things, that's what I'm paying for, to actually people being asked, can you diagnose this problem remotely? Can you not have someone come to site? I've even had discussions with BMS companies, where they're seeing a move towards remote diagnostics now being charged at a premium versus engineer site visits. So before, where it was, what am I paying for? I want to see someone here. Actually bringing that person to site is now seen as a risk. So there's more of a question around, well, can you remotely diagnose this fault? Can you, do anything to limit these visits? Lifts, for the most part, lag behind other building systems in this respect. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see more pressure from buildings on saying, the man who runs the air conditioning, he can just log into this and tell me what's wrong and reset it. Why can't you do that with the lift? Well, a lift has more safety concerns than the air conditioning system. But the fact we can't get in and we can't see some of these statuses on a lot of equipment, I think will become a problem over time. The other thing that's obviously worth talking about is people flow. And this is now looking increasingly like flow routes through the building. So essentially buildings are putting in place one-way systems, and this is extending to the vertical transportation. So I've seen designating the lift for up and the stairs for down. Okay, that's fine, but I suspect realistically you're talking about that only being suitable for a 7-floor building. With duplex, we've seen one lift is designated as up, one lift is designated down. If you're lucky enough to have multiple groups of lifts, we'll designate a group for up and a group for down. When you're having these conversations with buildings, you do need to impress upon them, though, that there is always the accessibility of the building to consider. The lift for up and the stairs for down is perfectly fine until you have a mobility impaired building user there. They're going to have to use the lift both ways. How is that going to work? You don't want to put these people under any kind of social pressure where they feel they can't use this. And also you don't want to limit the accessibility to your building. An interesting point that starts to come out very quickly, though, is if you think about this sort of a change in the way we want passengers to use the lifts, in conjunction with social distancing, means that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say right now, every building essentially has too few lifts. And that's even if we assume that the building before going into this situation had enough lifts anyway. Anyone who's spent time in and around buildings in New York typically know that most of these skyscrapers are horribly under elevated. Well, if I'm now going to limit how many people can use the lifts, and you can only use one lift in a certain direction and another lift in another direction, you're going to impact that build efficiency even more. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get onto the social distancing slide. Cleaning, this is one that's coming up a lot. Enhanced cleaning regimes means that you're potentially now in a commercial office building looking at the lift being cleaned every hour, possibly more so at particularly busy times of the day. So in the morning when we're loading the building and in the evening when we're unloading it. Again, we need to talk to buildings about the effects on interiors, specifically buttons and COPs. I have heard cases of cleaners swamping the COPs with disinfectant and Lord knows what else. It's seeping behind the button because, it's a commercial office building. It's not some bulletproof vandal resistant COP, and shorting out the whole panel. Also, it's a great way on older COPs to start bringing in a bit of button rot. If I've got disinfectant ingressing in there, getting to the plastic backs on the buttons and so on, it may well be we don't see this problem today, but in a few months' time, we're going and looking at failed buttons because we've rotted the backs off them. The best solution I've seen to this, and again, there are other solutions available, cover the buttons and then clean the cover. You can see there one of the removable covers from K-POC 88, and also Schindler have launched a product which is the Schindler Clean cover. That's more an application for the whole inside of the car. But that plastic cover there, multiple people are touching it, okay, that's a problem. But if a cleaner can just come in and either rip that cover down and swamp it with disinfectant, clean it and put it back up, or just swamp straight onto it, that is much better than putting an entire fixture at peril, because ultimately the cleaner's being told, get every surface cleaned. And with the best will in the world, maybe on the first pass, they'll be sensitive to the buttons. But by the time they've gone round on hour number 5, I think we'd all be doing it. They'll be sloshing cleaner everywhere. So that's just some of the things to bear in mind when it comes to the actual physical cleaning side of it. What I've referred to as hygiene, and we're seeing this almost develop as a new segment to our market, hygiene and sanitization. Really, I've broken this down into 2 sections. Firstly, air sanitization. And I looked at this quite closely about a month ago. So there's a lot of these types of solutions entering the market right now. What I'm seeing is that most of them are based on UVC light. So we're pulling air out of the car, passing it through typically some kind of physical filter. So these are usually HEPA filters, then through a UVC lighting chamber and back into the car. I've seen these mounted in the car as a surface mount, mounted on top of the car, and even seeing them being built into lifts now as part of the air circulation system. It's important to note how these actually work and what it is we're trying to achieve with these though, because really all we're talking about is reducing what's called the viral load in the air. So how much is floating around in the air that could potentially affect someone else? To understand how effective something's going to be, we need to understand how long this process is going to take. So a good question to ask with a lot of these solutions is, how many air changes can you perform an hour? So if I understand the volumetric space inside my car, how many times can you pull all of that air out, pass it through your UV filter and pump it back in? It's important to note with these, if I'm in a lift with someone else and they sneeze and we're not wearing masks, this thing is not going to save me from that. This is talking about reducing the viral load in the air when people aren't in the car. I think there is a danger with some of these that intentionally or otherwise they may get oversold. And it's always important with all of this to talk about it in the context of everything else the building is doing. Just putting one of these in on its own is not going to be enough. You are going to need to do things in the rest of the building. You are going to need to think about other measures in and around the lift itself. That brings me on to the subject of interior sanitization. It's all well and good to have a cleaner going through there every hour, but is there a smarter way of doing this? One of the things that I'm seeing is, again, a lot of these UVC-based light solutions. I'm not going to comment on specific solutions because I obviously don't know the technical aspects of these. But what I would say is a question to ask on these is, if you're shining a UVC light inside the car, either on the whole interior or portions of it, how can you be assured there are no passengers in the car when that light comes on? The example I always use when talking about things like this is, what about the drunk person asleep on the floor? Now, if it's a nice high-end office building, hopefully we won't have a drunk asleep on the floor, but we know this goes on. Because if I've got a drunk asleep on the floor and I'm using some sort of motion sensor to determine there's no one here, I may not be able to pick them up. I may not be able to pick them up with certain other types of sensor as well. UVC light, as a rule, is not eye safe, and it will give you a free suntan. Now, there's talk about using far UVC. There's a bunch of different technologies out there which claim to be safe. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. I don't know. What I've read implies that there may not be the long-term studies to back up some of these claims. But if a customer wants one of these put in, that's the customer's decision. But I would have a very, very detailed conversation with the manufacturer of this to understand in what ways is it safe and in what ways can you prove that safety, especially if it's something where I need to know there's no one in the car. How are you going to assure me there's no one in the car before you start blasting it with UV? The other point I would make around a lot of these is I see a lot of kills X percentage of bacteria. Well, okay, what about viruses? And there's a big debate here about, if I'm killing bacteria, am I also killing viruses? Without going into the lengthy studies, it would seem that there's an argument that says, yes, killing of bacteria is valid, or no, you actually need to be talking about the effectiveness against viruses. There's a lot of this stuff out there. I get bombarded every day on LinkedIn with the latest UV light-based solution. Talk to the supplier, talk to whoever's importing it, understand what it is, understand what it's actually capable of, because my conversations with facilities managers, what I'm seeing on these webinars that are being run by a lot of the facilities groups and so on, IWFM, is there's beginning to be a debate around this about saying, is this snake oil? Now, there are any number of solutions out there that look really good, that make really clear and honest claims. Equally, I'm seeing a lot of stuff that I think is being oversold. So we do need to be careful that this stuff doesn't start to get a bad name, and that bad name starts to have other associations. Again, I'm not singling anyone out. I know there's a number of people supplying these, and there's always good and bad in the market. But I think this is an area where we need to be particularly careful, and we do need to push for a little bit more information than is necessarily in some of the sales flyers today. So contactless is something that's coming up a lot as well, this desire for the contactless environment. I spoke to a security company, an access company, a few months ago, and they had been going to go all in on biometrics this year. Everything was going to be a thumbprint. Well, unfortunately for them, they're tearing all of those systems out and are going back to the good old key fobs, because I don't want to press my thumb onto something that everybody else in the building has touched. So there's this, I couldn't really come up with a good phrase for this, but I've said tools for avoiding touching surfaces. And you can see there the little brass button push, which Dewhurst are selling through A&A. The reason I picked that out over every other brass little tool I've seen is Dewhurst are making charity donations off the back of that, which I think is quite nice. But yeah, a dedicated brass or surgical steel item that we carry. Toothpicks available in the lift car. I've seen a piece of foam stuck to the wall with toothpicks in. Take the pen out of your pocket and use the pen. Something which had been in use in places in hospitals and so on for a long while was, if you're carrying a piece of paper, put the piece of paper up to the button and press the piece of paper. Obviously, with all of that, there's an element of touch. Obviously, the brass and surgical steel items are better, are better at preventing communication of virus and germs and so on. But there is still this element of touch. So something I'm seeing again is people looking at gesture control, and Dewhurst were happy enough to share these two images with me of their new contactless LOP. There are other solutions available from other people in the market. So here we're removing the touch altogether. So we have the traditional buttons because we need to keep those for our visually impaired passengers. They need to be able to find that button, find the braille and so on. But this idea that, well, I'm not visually impaired, I don't want to touch the button, so now I can just wave my hand in front of it. Certainly these options are retrofittable, which is quite nice. There's a possible issue around false calls. Anything that relies on a gesture. I'm a great one for gesticulating as I'm talking. Potentially you could get a false call. I think the easiest thing to look at on these is the range. What's the range on that motion sensor that's picking up that gesture? Most of these can be reset. I think the Dewhurst one can get down to around about 6 centimeters or so. Obviously, not being a Dewhurst employee, please check their literature and website for that claim. We're also seeing solutions now being developed that can actually distinguish between different types of gesture. So moving my hand up or moving my hand down, a single sensor can maybe see that. I haven't seen anything in our industry yet, but I am starting to see that, especially from some of our sister companies in the wider Halma group who are engaged in access control and industrial controls and so on. But again, it's one to talk to clients about. I think a lot of buildings will want to see things like this, get excited about it, but there's going to be an element of cost to fitting these. Can you retrofit things? Where can things be retrofitted and so on? But I think we will inherently move toward this idea of, if there's a contactless solution, buildings are going to be interested in it. So Obviously, what I haven't touched on, and probably the biggest impact so far, is social distancing. So CIBSE put out this document, COVID-19 lift use and occupancy, which is well worth a read. It's free to download. And they gave some examples of, with the 2 meter distancing rule, an 800 kilogram lift car, realistically, that's 2 passengers only. Even with the bigger 2,500 capacity cars, you know, these would be nominally 21 people, we're down to 5. So there's a massive impact on building efficiency there straight away. The first phase we've seen of this is signage and attendance in the lobby. This was a picture that I took in the Bracknell Town Centre the other day of some signage which has been placed on the lift doors. You can also see off to one side a hand sanitizer has been installed. But we're seeing a lot of buildings go with signage and attendance in the lobby. Now, that attendant, whoever that person is, whoever that member of building staff is, by putting them in that lobby and having them act almost as an old-fashioned, I suppose they're somewhere between the old-fashioned lift attendants and lift dispatchers, back when a dispatcher was a person, they're in there, they're in that lobby as we're loading the building at different times of day. There's an inherent decision there to put somebody at risk, because you're saying, right, I need you to go and stand in the lobby as there's many people entering the building. You are putting that person at increased risk of infection. There's no two ways about it. So the main initial thrust that I've seen on this is people beginning to look at the load weighing system to limit capacity. I think there's a few things to talk about here. One, have you got a load weigher and do you have access to being able to reset it? I've heard people talk about fitting additional load weighers. You know, for me, fitting an additional load weigher, especially here you have to do full load tests, is an awful lot of work at a time when buildings are going to want their lifts running. Also, if you're using the load weigher in such a way that it would genuinely take the lift out of service, and in fairness, that's not necessarily what I'm seeing people talk about. I'm seeing it more set up so that we're going to change when the lift will or won't ignore floor calls. If you're taking the lift out of service, again, you're going to be really impacting the efficiency of those lifts. The other thing to note here, and it's actually on that piece of signage, is a lot of people are going with this only members of one household in the lift at any time. This is quite common in retail spaces. But if you think about it in a retail or even a residential environment, if you've got a family of 5 in a small car like that, well, they're one household. They're free to mix together. So if I'm going with a system that says, I want to look for the minimum occupancy of 2 people and then take the lift out of service, well, why can't that family of 5 travel together? So it again throws up this, you know, how are we going to manage this? What's available? For our part, we've developed what we're calling the Avaya social distancer. So this is a very simple system. We have an occupancy sensor in the car. It's a visual based system and it runs what we call an object detection algorithm. So we're not looking at faces. We're not looking at anything else. What we're saying is this algorithm has been trained to say this object is a person, this object is not. And we've had some quite fun tests with this in the office with people going in and out of rooms and also moving objects with them, and it works really quite well. We then have a control box on top of the car. The control box is wired to the occupancy sensor. The control box is where all the processing goes on. And then we also have the option to wire across to the door operator light curtain input. So taking some of the graphics from our website on how this works, I'll just talk you through it. So here's our nice lift in our office building. 1 passenger gets in, that's fine. 2nd passenger gets in, and we have a speaker in that top of car control box, which will read out a message saying social distancing limit of 2 passengers reached, no more passengers to enter. So we're giving a clear, audible warning to say nobody else getting this lift. People being people, this 3rd person tries to muscle in, and we change the announcement to say social distancing limit exceeded, 1 passenger must exit the car. So we're actually applying here a little bit of social pressure, a little bit of not quite naming and shaming, but very similar. So this message will play. if you've decided to wire across to the door operator light curtain input, we can also trigger an input exactly as we would from a set of our light curtains, which makes it look to the door operator like it has a trigger on its light curtains. So it's going to hold the doors open. Now, I talked on the last slide about not wanting to take the lift out of service. The reason we've done it this way is if you've got nudge mode set up on those doors, they will stay open until they time out, and then they will close in nudge. I can't develop a system that's physically going to come and haul that third person out, but if I can read out this audible warning, if I can delay the departure of the elevator, I'm putting pressure on that third passenger to say, come on, do the right thing, step out, wait for the next lift. In the situation we talked about where possibly it's a family, so it's multiple people from a single household, you could even have a situation with disabled people and their carers and so on. This is going to be an inconvenience for them, but fundamentally the lift is still going to close its doors and take off at some point. But really our aim here is to get that third person to think about what they've done and step out. All the while, this is not something you need to connect to the lift controller. I don't need an extra person in the lobby at risk of infection. And this is a way, especially on sites where you don't necessarily have as many building staff you can use for this, of fairly easily and quickly installing something which is going to make it very clear to people that they're not adhering to the social distancing guidelines, and will hold that lift there for a short time, the time it takes the doors to go into nudge, but hopefully enough time that that third person goes, oh, right, I will step out, I will do the right thing. This is available to order in the UK now, and we are launching to the rest of Europe on the 20th of July. We've looked at a number of different things that we could have done. This is the thing that we decided to do because ultimately it picks up on technology we already had or we were already developing. And it's a fairly low touch way of doing this. You're not having to hack into controllers or anything more elaborate than that. Really fitting one of these is not going to be terribly different to fitting a telephone on top of the car or to fitting a set of light curtains. But yeah, that's what we're doing for our part. You'll see this on our social media, on our website and so on, and certainly if you talk to any of our salespeople in the UK. Okay, so once again, a fairly whirlwind tour through that. Hopefully you've seen some things you may have not seen before. Maybe some of this gives you some food for thought. Em, do we have any questions?
Ooh, just realised I was still muted, sorry. We do have a couple of questions. If anyone else has any, please go ahead. One, just to keep on the same track with ESD, does it work only with the wire safety edges?
No, so that's a great point to make, actually. We're not getting involved with the safety edge. To be very clear, if you would like a new set of wire safety edges, we're more than happy to sell them to you. But we didn't want to limit this product by saying it only works with our safety edges light curtains. So you're connecting to the door operator here. And we have a couple of different settings on the device to account for door operators that look for a normally open or a normally closed contact, depending on what you've got wired in. So yeah, this is, as I say, no need to connect to the controller. All you're looking for is to pick up on that standard input on the door operator.
Okay, if a hygiene product is installed, who do you think is responsible for changing the filters, UV bulbs, etc.? Do you know?
Right. Again, this is an interesting area of debate about who's responsible for the maintenance of that, you know, of the filter, of the UV light source. UV LEDs are inherently less efficient than white light LEDs, so there will be a need to change those. You could argue that it is, I guess, a sort of consumable around the lift. So, you know, I'd make the argument that it's no different from changing a spent lamp in the car for those which still have fluorescent tubes and so on. But it is something to think about as a maintenance company if you're putting one of these in. Is it on me or is it on the building? And it's likely to be on you because if we're honest, we don't want building engineers going and, excuse me, we don't really want building engineers in the cars changing things. So it probably will need to form part of the maintenance agreement moving forward. I suspect a lot of that will be on a case-by-case basis, but certainly those are the conversations I've had with people.
And moving on to the next question then. Any options? Okay, so have you seen any options for gesture control in the lift car for the COP?
So I have, I've seen a lot of work on this in Asia. I've also seen a company called NeoNode out of, I think nominally speaking, they're out of the US. I think it's a joint US-German company. I don't remember exactly. What a lot of people are talking about are some sort of overlay onto the COP. Well, actually, I've seen two things. I've seen an overlay on the COP, which gives you an infrared light grid in front of the COP. And as you break those beams, it would give you the same as a floor call. The issue with a lot of those is I see those being promoted by people from outside of our industry. So I would challenge how easy those would be to wire into existing COPs and specifically to get access to the buttons. The other thing I've seen, I think it was Otis India put a video out on social media of this, of installing a gesture recognition COP next to the existing COP. That's obviously, again, has some issues about how you then get those, those gesture recognition points back to the controller. A lot of the solutions seem pretty rough and ready. It would not surprise me if the fixture companies, the Dewhursts and the AAA of this world are working on something around this. The other one that I didn't include in this presentation and sort of falls into this is Vantage in the US have partnered with MAD fixtures out of Canada, and they actually have a foot pedal COP, which is something that I never thought I'd see in the Western world. But there, if you look it up, it's called Toe2Go product. It essentially says that, yeah, the best thing is that we just have steel foot pedals in the car and we kick those for where we want to go. So I suspect in the next 6 months or so, we'll see more around this. It's going to be on what's the appetite of the building to have these things retrofitted in. And I'm sure the OEMs will come along, your Schindler's Clean Mobility piece and everything. I'm sure the OEMs will come along with an option for new lift installs. I suspect it's a matter of time. And I think like a lot of these things, it will be directly linked to how long this situation goes on for. So, yeah, I think it's coming. I suspect most things today, you would struggle to tie into an existing system, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, no, agreed. Right, does anyone else have any questions? Because Matt, I think you might have just answered everyone's questions all at once. Yeah. Because I think that is all for today. If nothing else pops into the inbox. Thank you for joining. If you haven't already seen, if you missed any of our webinars before, some of them are appearing on YouTube, so you can go back and you can watch those. Email us if you have any questions and let us know if there's any future topics that you would like to see. Okay, right, thank you very much.